I'm a feminist and an investigative journalist from the Netherlands. And for 10 years, I've done research into the Dutch sex industry. The Netherlands was the first country in the world to legalize prostitution. This happened 19 years ago in 2000. At the time, it was considered a liberal and progressive approach to the problem of prostitution. The aim of this new approach was to improve the position of women in prostitution and to combat forced prostitution, prostitution by undocumented women, and prostitution of minors. I hear that several states in the United States are now considering a similar approach. Given that fact, it is very important to have a very close look at how legalization of prostitution worked out in my country. First of all, it's important to have a clear view of the Dutch situation. Other than in many countries, women in Dutch prostitution weren't criminalized to begin with. They were free to sell sex. Sex buyers weren't criminalized either. They were free to buy sex. What was forbidden was pimping and keeping a brothel. So practically, the legalization of prostitution meant that the ban on brothel keeping was lifted. The new system enabled brothel keepers to legally run a brothel if they applied for a license and complied with a number of rules, of which the most important ones was that they were not allowed to employ underage girls, undocumented women, and trafficked women. The brothel keepers were submitted to regular controls by the police to see if they stuck to the regulation. The philosophy behind this approach is very interesting. It was that one could divide the sex industry into two different worlds. On the one hand, the world of forced prostitution, where vulnerable women were forced by pimps to sell their bodies. But on the other hand, the world of free prostitution, peopled by women who freely chose to do so and were happy to do so. Of course, forced prostitution was considered problematic, and the Dutch wanted to seriously address it by a renewed law against human trafficking. But the so-called free prostitution was something the Dutch didn't want to be too moralistic about. It was considered to be the woman's choice, and it was firmly believed that women should be free to make that choice. The legalization advocates argued that prostitution should be considered just another form of work. And that was the aim of the legalization, to turn prostitution into just another form of work and to make the sex industry transparent so that it would be clear for everyone to see what exactly was going on there. The aim of legalization was to create a clean prostitution sector where women could work freely, unhampered by pimps. According to the Dutch, the most important problem in the prostitution sector was the stigma that stuck to the women. It was the stigma that traumatized them and made them vulnerable, they argued. The idea was that if prostitution would be normalized and considered as work, the stigma would vanish and the women could become independent sex workers who even paid taxes. They would become entrepreneurs who could fend for themselves, and pimps would simply disappear because the women wouldn't need them anymore. This approach was considered realistic and pragmatic. Prostitution was seen as an unavoidable phenomenon. It was accepted as unavoidable that men would always need to buy sex, and it was accepted as unavoidable that women would always need to sell sex. So the Dutch argued the best thing to do was to normalize it. This change in policy was advocated by left-wing parties and liberal feminists who maintained that women have the right to be in prostitution and that women have the right to do with their bodies whatever they want. The Dutch government was totally oblivious to the fact that prostitution is exactly that one area where women never do with their bodies what they want. they will do with their bodies what the pimps want, and they will do with their bodies what the buyers want. In hindsight, dear people, it is hard not to be overwhelmed by the naivety of the Dutch politicians who implemented the legalization. So here's where I come in. About 10 years ago, I firmly believed that legalization was a progressive approach to prostitution and that we, the Dutch, had reason to be proud of the liberal and innovative way we handled the problem, and that we could be an example to the rest of the world. As you can understand, I didn't really knew much about the sex industry. I knew about cases of forced prostitution, but I thought these were just criminal excesses. I was simply a feminist journalist interested in writing about the many ways in which the freedom of women is restricted in this world. I wrote, for example, about honor violence in migrant cultures and about sexual violence in strict religious families. But I hadn't touched upon the sex industry yet. At one point in my life, I was thinking by myself, what would actually be the worst violation of a woman's freedom? And I thought, that must be forced prostitution. I thought, what can be worse than being in the hands of a man or a gang who control your life and force you to have sex with, let's say, 10 or 15 strangers a day? I also thought, how can a human being psychologically survive a thing like that? That question really kept haunting me. I decided to find out by writing a book about the subject. So I knew a woman who ran a shelter for victims of forced prostitution, or human trafficking, as she called it. And I asked her, is there anything you could do for me to help me write my book? And she answered, why not begin by doing something for us? I thought that was a great idea. So I ended up as a volunteer in that shelter. And it was a great way to start my investigation because I immediately got to know the women. They mainly came from poor countries in Africa and Eastern Europe, and some came from the Far East. It was my job to do all kinds of leisure activities with the women who lived in the shelter. So I took them to the market in Amsterdam on a Monday morning, or we took a ferry to the northern part of the city to drink coffee and eat apple pie. It was fun. It was great fun. The women were strong survivors who grabbed every opportunity to feel normal and lead a happy life again. I have very good memories of them. But the stories they told me were deeply disturbing. Many of the women in the shelter were pregnant or HIV infected because their pimps hadn't allowed them to use condoms. There was one woman called Grace who was both pregnant and HIV infected, and she was so scared to be sent back to her home country, Nigeria, because she wouldn't get good medication there. And I will also never forget the story of Renate from Uganda, who was locked in a room by her pimps and denied food and drink until she submitted to their will. Renate was so traumatized that she heard voices in the night. We became friends, and we still call each other now and then, and she's doing as well as she can. I would like you to know that. By hearing all the stories of the women in the shelter, I started to ask myself some really important questions. I asked myself, if these things happen in a country that thinks it has solved the problem of prostitution by legalizing it, obviously something is very wrong here. That's when I decided I needed to find more about the Dutch sex industry as a whole, not limiting myself to so-called human trafficking. I started with the window prostitution in the Amsterdam red light district because it was easy to knock on the windows of the women and start up a conversation with them. So that's what I began doing. I visited these women in the rooms, and I was confronted with the reality of their working conditions, and they were bleak. Standing behind a window all day, being glared at, being assessed by men who see you as a piece of meat, being mocked by tourists constantly, is in itself a traumatizing experience. Some women told me they played loud music not to hear the insults. But of course, standing behind the window is just a small part of what they had to go through. there's also the psychological and physical violence of the sex buyers and the pimps. Consequently, I spoke with nearly everybody who could tell me anything about the Dutch industry, from police officers, aid workers, sex buyers, pimps, policymakers, prosecutors, researchers, but most importantly, survivors. Women who left the sex industry and had a detached perspective of what actually had happened to them. And they said to me, "Let nobody fool you, Renate. Legislation didn't make this business a better place for women." So what I learned was that the women in the legal Dutch prostitution did not become the empowered entrepreneurs that the Dutch government assumed legalization would make of them. I found out that behind most of these women, there was still a man who in some way took advantage of them. And I found out that the majority of the women was young and from poor countries and that they were vulnerable. In 2007, the Dutch government issued an official evaluation of the legalization that was mildly positive, although it admitted that pimps were still present in the sex industry. And it also reported that the well-being of women in prostitution had slightly deteriorated. They used, for example, more tranquilizers than 6 years ago. But the biggest blow to the faith in legalized prostitution came in 2008, when the national police issued a report about the biggest case of human trafficking the country had ever experienced. A gang of Turkish pimps had come in from Germany in the late 90s and became rulers of the Amsterdam red light district. They exploited at least 120 women in prostitution. Their methods were brutal. The women had to undergo forced breast enlargement, forced abortions, and forced tattoos. They were beaten up with baseball bats. And this went on for almost 10 years behind legal windows. That's when the Dutch public and the Dutch policymakers realized that the legalization of prostitution had been a failure. Last week, I was talking to 2 prosecutors who maintained that the legalization has even increased the inflow of pimps from Eastern Europe, where people are so poor that women are easy to recruit. The legalization of prostitution was implemented, and that was the stupid thing about it, just a few years before a number of poor European countries were allowed to enter the European Union. This meant that their residents can travel freely without the use of a passport to all countries in the European Union. So this makes trafficking a lot easier. Legalizing prostitution in the Netherlands was, so to speak, an invitation for Eastern European criminals to come over to Amsterdam, where much more money was to be made in the sex industry than in their own country. All they needed to do was to ensure the woman they wanted to exploit was not underage and that she was so afraid to talk to the police. During the years of legalization, the Dutch sex industry became harder and more violent. It's not possible to say that that is only due to legalization, but there's no doubt that legalization has a market where international networks of pimps exploit vulnerable women from poor countries who are used by sex buyers who can justify their acts by saying that what they do is legal. This of the Social Democratic Party, Lodewijk Asscher, to remark years later, we have been reprehensibly naive when we legalized prostitution. But still, there is a vast army of liberal feminists and, yes, aid workers who deny the reality of my country. Keep on the mantra that women should do with their bodies what they want, and that sex work can be rewarding work and should be a normal profession. The Dutch Sex Workers Union consists of a small group of mainly Dutch women with experience in prostitution who seize every opportunity to state they like their work and that they are proud of it. Are you all hearing me clearly? I hear sometimes my phone is sort of acting strangely. Anyway, they seize every opportunity to state that they like their work and that they are proud of it. The voices of the majority of vulnerable women from poor countries are never heard. The press, even respected newspapers, repeatedly write stories about women who love to be a sex worker. Although some journalists take the pain to look deeper into the sex industry, the state ideology that prostitution should be considered a normal form of work is very strong in my country. That's why I decided to set up the first feminist abolitionist group in the Netherlands, to try to enlighten the public about the realities of prostitution. It was a very scary thing to do, because the pro-prostitution lobby is so strong, and I was constantly reviled, and many people didn't understand what really was my purpose. Was I some kind of prudish person who was trying to put my moralist views upon this great free nation? But I had to explain again and again that it's all about human rights. Slowly, I gathered a group of about 50 people around me. Christians and Christian feminists and feminist Christians and feminists and Christian Christians. In short, great people. We didn't and we still don't have money. I hope somebody hears this. Some dollars. But we managed to organize the first abolitionist conference, not in just some kind of room, but in the building of the Dutch Parliament. My great abolitionist sister, Julie Bindel, who's been here and spoke here, spoke during that first conference, and it was a landmark event. After this, there have been many other abolitionist events, and it became easier and easier to organize them. Most importantly, a group of young Dutch people called Expose presented 40,000 signatures in favor of the Swedish prostitution model to Dutch members of parliament last spring. 40,000 signatures in a population of 50 million people. That's really good. In the years that I've been an activist, I've seen some changes occur in the mentality in my country when it comes to prostitution. But the pro-prostitution lobby is still very strong and well funded. But there is hope. Even the new mayor of Amsterdam, who as a member of parliament was a staunch advocate of the legalization, has now said in a newspaper interview that she thinks it's unacceptable that vulnerable women are exhibited behind windows in the Amsterdam red light district. Yeah, that was good. The Dutch system was built on naive and false assumptions about the nature of the sex industry. The first false assumption was that one could make a division between the world of forced prostitution on the one hand and the world of free prostitution on the other hand. The overwhelming majority of the women in prostitution are neither chained to the bedpost nor happy hookers. They belong to the vast grey area of women who are tricked or manipulated into prostitution, often because previous experiences of domestic or sexual violence, homelessness or sheer poverty that have made them vulnerable. One cannot simply say we are going to combat the world of forced prostitution and clean up the world of free prostitution, because there cannot be such a distinction. There are no two different worlds. It's one sex industry, and within it, everything is intertwined. Secondly, obliging brothel keepers to obtain a license and submitting them to rules and police controls does not do away with pimps. Yeah, thank you. In my country, often the brothel keepers are not even the pimps. The pimps bring in the girls, and the brothel keepers might work together with the pimps or turn a blind eye to the fact that a woman is in the hands of a pimp. They might have their own ways to earn too much money from the women, but generally speaking, they are not the pimps. So what good does it do when you subject the brothel keepers to all kinds of regulations, but you give a free rein to the pimps? And then there is a central question. What good are rules and regulations when you are dealing with a world that is controlled by organized crime? How can you talk about empowering women in prostitution when you deal with criminals that are ready to beat her up with a baseball bat? Exploitation can easily continue in spite of police controls. It's easy to check if a woman has a passport, but it's very difficult to prove that she's in the hands of a pimp. She will be too afraid or too brainwashed to open her mouth. And another thing, if you decide to legalize prostitution, you have to increase your police forces to find and arrest the men who exploit the women. This is a difficult task, and it requires a lot of knowledge and expertise and a lot of passion on the part of the police officers. I know some very good ones in the Netherlands, but they are few, and they have become even fewer because a lot of police capacity has taken off human trafficking to devote attention to other problems like terrorism. And there's a third flaw in the Dutch philosophy behind legalization. The license and regulation system only applies to legal prostitution. But what about illegal prostitution? There is reason to believe that a part of the Dutch sex industry went underground after the legalization. Brothel keepers who didn't want to obtain a license and stick to all kinds of rules, or brothel keepers who were denied a license, disappeared underground, where there are no police controls. And that's the third problem with the Dutch legalization system. The rules and controls are only applied to brothel keepers with a license, but it did nothing to address unlicensed prostitution, which is, according to the Dutch police, a sector that's growing fast. What the Dutch wanted to do was impossible. You cannot create a clean prostitution sector. You cannot normalize prostitution simply because the act of paying for sex can never be normal. It is an expression of deep inequality between women and men, poor and rich, and black and white. Thank you. You cannot normalize this inequality just like you cannot normalize slavery. The sex industry is an industry where an incredible amount of money is to be made. This will always attract organized crime. You can't beat organized crime by legalizing the brothels in which they operate. In fact, legalization has certainly not made things more difficult for organized crime. The Dutch believed that their approach was pragmatic, but in reality it was based on a naive, idealistic image of the situation of women in prostitution. It totally underestimated the power of organized crime in the sex industry. It did nothing to reduce any harm whatsoever. Almost 20 years after the legalization, there have been several government and police reports that have shown that this approach did not improve the position of women in prostitution and did not diminish human trafficking. There's a general consensus now in the Netherlands that the legalization has been a failure. Since 2008, the government has been discussing a new prostitution law because the legalization simply hasn't worked. But now, 11 and many political discussions later, this law has still not been realized. Boys in the Netherlands now grow up with the idea that buying sex is a thing you can simply do. It's legal, isn't it? The presence of window prostitution in the middle of several Dutch cities is an encouragement for men to make use of these women. By legalizing prostitution, the Dutch government has issued a statement. We accept prostitution as an unavoidable phenomenon in our society, and this has an impact on the mentality of men and on the equality between men and women. What is needed is a policy that addresses the buyer and makes men aware of what they are actually doing when they are buying sex. Prostitution is an industry that is driven by demand. Therefore, you need to address the demand. Contrary to many liberal feminists who see prostitution as an expression of the free choice of women, radical feminists understand that prostitution is only a free choice for the buyer. Thank you. What is needed as well is good sexual education. that teaches boys that buying sex is not something you can simply do, that teaches them that women cannot be objectified and that their orifices cannot be bought.